Imagine, you're celebrating inheriting $96 million, and a second later, a notification pops up on your phone that all your accounts are frozen forever. My father just handed over the keys to the company to my brother, cutting me out of his life after 5 years of slavish devotion. He laughed in my face until he opened my parting gift. That night, they lost more than just money, they lost their home, their name, and their future. I'm Juliana Thorne, and I'll show you how a single legal document can destroy an entire dynasty of traitors. Have you ever wondered what $96 million of family betrayal feels like? My name is Julian Thorne. Tonight, at the inheritance dinner everyone had been anticipating for months, my father finally said the words out loud. He raised his glass, a thin smile playing on his lips as he looked at my younger brother, Leo, who had been back home for exactly 4 weeks. Everything, the company, the estates, the accounts. All $96 million now belongs to Leo. My mother nodded with a look of fierce pride. He deserves it more than you ever did, Julian. The room erupted in polite applause. I stood up slowly, walked to the head of the table, and placed 4 items directly in front of my father. First, the original medical and financial power of attorney documents he and my mother had signed years ago, back when they were so frail they could barely hold a pen. Then, the house keys, the safe keys, and a thick manila envelope sealed with heavy red wax. I looked straight at Leo. Congratulations. Then I turned and headed for the door. My father let out a short, dismissive laugh, likely thinking I was leaving some dramatic, self-pitying goodbye note. He ripped the envelope open right there in front of 20 relatives and his oldest associates. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second. The crystal glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the dark oak floor. You've got to be kidding me, he roared, slamming the table so hard the silver rattled. This is insane. My mother shrieked. Leo froze. Every head in the room turned toward me, but I didn't stop walking. If you have ever been told you are worth nothing after giving everything, you understand. People often mistake silence for weakness. They underestimate the quiet ones because they don't see the foundation being moved beneath their feet. 5 years ago, I was living the life I had always wanted in Denver. I was a senior software architect at a health tech unicorn, pulling in nearly $300,000 a year, and leading a specialized AI team. My calendar was a blur of investor galas and keynote invitations. Then, on a Tuesday morning at dawn, my phone rang. It was the head nurse at a specialized clinic in Houston. My father had collapsed in his office, a massive ischemic stroke. By the time I landed in Texas 4 hours later, he was in a medically induced coma, his life sustained by the very machines his company distributed. 2 days later, the world collapsed further. My mother went in for what she thought was a persistent cough. It was stage 3 lung adenocarcinoma. Her first round of chemotherapy began that Monday. Within 6 weeks, she had lost 30 pounds and could barely lift a cup of coffee. I took an indefinite leave of absence, packed 2 suitcases, and moved back into my childhood bedroom in the outskirts of Austin. My firm in Denver told me to take all the time I needed. They replaced my position in 9 days. The first year was a blur of fluorescent lights and the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic. I slept on a vinyl recliner in my father's ICU room for more than 300 nights. I learned to clear his airway when the night staff was spread thin. I learned to administer my mother's medication at home because the local agencies were understaffed. By the 8th month, I could start in 4 in total darkness. When my father finally woke after 6 weeks, the stroke had stolen his speech. He could only squeeze my hand, twice for yes, once for no. My mother's hands shook so violently she couldn't sign a check. The hospital's legal counsel eventually sat me down. Texas law was clear. With both parents incapacitated, someone had to hold the power of attorney, or the state would intervene. They signed the documents that same afternoon, shaky, illegible marks witnessed by 2 nurses and a notary. That signature made me the acting CEO of Thorne Medical Logistics. There was no paycheck attached. I was 30 years old, running a 90-person company that manufactured ventilators and diagnostic equipment, all while pushing my mother's wheelchair to radiation treatments every morning. I taught myself corporate finance from textbooks and SEC filings at 2 a.m. after the nurses left. I signed vendor contracts, negotiated with insurance giants, and kept the payroll moving, all while my father watched me from his bed with eyes that seemed to apologize for his silence. Meanwhile, my brother Leo had vanished. The last we heard, he was in Albuquerque, spiraling into a haze of prescription opioids following a back injury. He had been arrested for possession 18 months before my father's stroke. The court gave him a choice: a mandatory residential program or prison. He chose the program. It had a strict no-contact policy for the first 6 months, and after that, he simply never called. My mother kept his room like a shrine, as if he were away at a prestigious university rather than ghosting his dying parents. I didn't have the energy to find him. Every dollar the company earned went toward keeping the factory lights on and paying for the experimental immunotherapy that my mother's insurance refused to cover. I fought those denials myself, writing appeals and flying to meetings with medical directors. By the 14th month, my father could finally whisper a few words. My mother's scans showed the tumors were shrinking. I let myself believe we were finally turning a corner. I was wrong. That corner was still 3.5 years away. The morning the doorbell rang at 7 sharp, I was buried in payroll reports, having not slept in over 30 hours. I opened the door to find Leo standing on the porch with nothing but a faded duffel bag. He looked different, thinner, clean-shaven, his eyes clear for the first time in a decade. "I finished the program," he said. "I've been clean for 14 months. They let me out 3 weeks ago." My mother ran from the kitchen and collapsed into his arms, sobbing as if he were a hero returning from the front lines. Within an hour, she had called every relative we had. By noon, the house smelled of cinnamon and unearned forgiveness. That same afternoon, the history of the last 5 years began to be rewritten. My mother sat my father down and told him, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, that Leo had been finding himself out west. She claimed he had been networking with suppliers and taking business courses. Every ugly truth was sanded down and replaced with a polished lie. By dinner, the official family narrative was set: Leo wasn't a recovering addict, he was an entrepreneur in training. The next day, he walked into the company like he owned the place. My mother marched him straight to the executive floor and introduced him to the staff as the future of Thorne Medical. The COO, a man who kept his job only because I had stabilized the firm during the crisis, shook Leo's hand as if he were royalty. 3 days later, my internal access was revoked. When I asked my father about it, he merely shrugged. "Your mother thinks it's time Leo took the reins. You've done enough, Julian. Go rest." I didn't leave. I kept showing up, slipping in through the warehouse entrance before dawn. I worked from an empty cubicle on the 3rd floor, fixing pricing errors that would have cost us 6 figures and approving purchase orders that Leo was too distracted to notice. At night, I went home to a house that no longer felt like mine and coded until the sun came up, building something that no one in that family knew existed. Leo started holding leadership summits in the conference room I used to run. He wore tailored shirts my mother ironed for him, and threw around buzzwords he'd found online. Employees who used to bring me coffee now looked away when we passed in the hall, afraid that acknowledging me would be seen as disloyalty to the new heir. My mother redecorated Leo's office that first weekend, hanging a sign on the door that read, "Leo Thorne, CEO." I stopped arguing. I just nodded, went back to my shadow workstation, and kept the company breathing while they planned a victory parade for a ghost who had been missing for the entire war. Every cent the company generated was funneled into keeping the machines running, and covering the staggering costs of my mother's experimental immunotherapy, treatments the insurance providers had rejected twice. I took on those battles personally, drafting the appeals and flying to Nashville to meet with medical directors face to face. By the 14th month, my father began speech therapy, eventually managing to whisper a ragged thank you. My mother's scans finally showed the tumors were receding. I allowed myself a moment of hope, believing the most difficult days were behind us. I was wrong. The true turning point wouldn't arrive for another 3.5 years. The doorbell rang at 7 sharp on a Tuesday. I was buried in quarterly payroll reports, my eyes burning after 31 hours without sleep. I opened the door, clutching a mug of cold coffee, and found Leo standing on the porch. He carried nothing but a faded canvas duffel. He looked different, thinner, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear for the first time since he was 17. "I finished the program," he said. 14 months clean. The court-ordered facility in New Mexico released me 3 weeks ago. My mother came running from the kitchen, her robe fluttering behind her. She took one look at him and collapsed into his arms, sobbing as if he were a soldier returning from a lost war. Within the hour, she had called every relative within 100 miles. By noon, the house was filled with the scent of cinnamon rolls and the hollow promise of second chances. That afternoon, the rewriting of our history began. My mother sat my father down in his study and told him, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, that Leo had simply been finding himself out west. She claimed he had been networking with suppliers in Santa Fe and enrolling in online business courses. Every jagged, ugly truth was sanded down and replaced with a polished new narrative. By dinner, the official family line was solidified: Leo had never been an addict. He had been an entrepreneur in training. The following day, he walked into the office as if he had never left. My mother escorted him straight to the executive floor, introducing him to the leadership team as the future of Thorne Medical Systems. The COO, a man named Elias who owed his very career to the fact that I had kept the firm solvent for 5 years, shook Leo's hand with exaggerated deference. He even asked if Leo wanted the corner office repainted. 3 days later, my internal login stopped working. When I called IT, they told me the COO had ordered a global password reset for security purposes. Translation: my access had been terminated. The invitations to board meetings simply stopped appearing in my inbox. When I confronted my father about it, he merely looked away. "Your mother felt it was time Leo took the lead," he muttered. "You've done your part, Julian." I kept showing up anyway. I slipped in through the loading docks before dawn and worked from a dusty, forgotten cubicle on the 3rd floor. I approved purchase orders that otherwise would have languished, fixed pricing errors that would have cost us a fortune, and sent out emails that went largely ignored. At night, I drove back to a home where I was a ghost. I ate lukewarm leftovers and coded on my laptop until the sun rose, building the architecture of something no one in that house knew existed. Leo began holding daily synergy meetings in the conference room I had occupied for years. He wore the crisp, tailored shirts my mother ironed for him and parroted buzzwords he'd picked up from podcasts: vertical integration, disruptive growth, market fluidity. The employees who used to bring me coffee now brought it to him. Those who still acknowledged me in the corridors did so with quick, nervous nods, their eyes darting away as if being seen with me was a liability. My mother spent the first weekend redecorating his old bedroom with a new desk and framed photos of his days as a high school athlete. She hung a small, engraved plaque on the door: Leo Thorne, CEO. Every time I walked past it, the air in the house felt a little thinner. My father's speech had improved enough for him to manage short, clipped sentences. He started asking Leo's opinion on everything: inventory management, new product lines, and whether we should bid on the massive Sterling regional contract. Every time I tried to offer a technical correction, my mother would cut me off with a thin, brittle smile. "Let your brother handle it, dear. You've done quite enough." I stopped arguing. I just nodded, retreated to my shadow workstation, and kept the company's heart beating while they planned a victory parade for a man who had been absent for the entire struggle. The night of the inheritance dinner, the grand chandelier in the dining room was dimmed to a warm, amber glow. 22 place settings were laid out across white linen. Silver clinked against crystal as the caterers made their rounds with the second bottle of vintage champagne. Everyone who mattered in our corner of Texas was there: uncles who held board seats, cousins who ran regional dealerships, my father's oldest associates, and even the family's longtime minister. My father stood at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal suit my mother had selected that morning. His voice was stronger than it had been in years. He didn't even need the microphone they had set up as a precaution. "Tonight isn't just about dinner," he began, raising his glass. "Tonight, we pass the torch to the next generation. To the person who has proven he belongs at the helm." He turned and placed a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. My brother wore a look of practiced humility, a grin he had likely been perfecting in the mirror for weeks. "Last week, I finalized the legal transfers," my father continued. $96 million in company equity, the real estate portfolio, and the investment accounts. Everything now belongs to Leo. A wave of applause swept around the table. Someone let out a celebratory whistle. Aunt Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. My mother reached over and gripped Leo's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked across the table at me, past the rosemary-crusted lamb, and offered the coldest smile I had ever seen. "He deserves it so much more than you ever did, Julian." The words were sharp and precise. A few of the cousins shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to cast their gaze. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. I walked the length of the table, my footsteps muffled by the heavy rug, and stopped beside my father. One by one, I laid 4 items on the white cloth. First, the original power of attorney documents, creased from years of being carried in my briefcase. Second, the heavy brass ring of house keys. Third, the key to the document vault in his study. And finally, a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax and embossed with my initials. Every eye in the room was fixed on my hands. The light from the chandelier made the wax look like a fresh wound. I met Leo's stare with a calm, steady gaze. "Congratulations," I said softly. Then I turned and walked toward the archway. My father let out a short, dismissive chuckle, the same sound he used to make when I was a child asking for his attention. He clearly thought the envelope contained a resignation letter, or a desperate plea for a smaller slice of the pie. He picked it up, slid a silver butter knife under the seal, and tore it open right there between the dessert and the coffee. He pulled out the first page. His eyes scanned the header, then the first few lines. The butter knife clattered onto the porcelain plate. The color drained from his face so quickly, I could see the change from 20 feet away. He looked up at me, his mouth working but no sound emerging, before finally finding his voice in a roar that shook the crystal. "You have got to be kidding me." My mother half rose from her seat, her hand at her throat. "Richard, what is it?" He couldn't answer. He just stared at the papers in his hand, his fingers trembling as if the pages were burning his skin. My mother reached over and squeezed Leo's hand, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked directly at me across the rosemary-scented remains of the dinner, and offered the most poisonous smile I had ever seen. "He deserves this far more than you ever did, Julian." The words were precise, intended to draw blood. A few of the cousins shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their silverware. Uncle Thomas tried to start another round of applause, but the sound withered and died. I pushed my chair back. The room went silent in that heavy way it does when people sense a kill. I walked the length of the table, my footsteps silent on the rug, and stopped beside my father. One by one, I placed 4 things in the center of the white linen. First, the original medical and financial power of attorney, yellowed and creased from years in my safe. Second, the heavy brass ring of house keys he had given me the day I moved back to Texas. Third, the single silver key to the document vault in his study. And finally, a thick manila envelope, the red wax seal bearing my initials. Every eye in the room followed my hands. Under the amber glow of the chandelier, the wax looked like a fresh wound. I met Leo's eyes. I was calm, steady. "Congratulations," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I turned and began walking toward the archway leading to the foyer. My father let out a short, dismissive laugh, the same one he used when I was 12 and begged to go on his hunting trips. He thought he knew what was inside, a resignation, a plea for mercy, perhaps a tear-stained apology. He picked up the envelope, slid his butter knife under the seal, and ripped it open right there between the creme brulee and the port. The first page slid out. His eyes scanned the header, then the second line, then the third. The butter knife clattered against the fine china. The color drained from his face so fast I could see the grayness from across the room. He looked up at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out, before he finally roared loud enough to rattle the crystal. "You've got to be kidding me." My mother half rose from her chair, her hand trembling. "Richard, what is it?" He couldn't answer. He just stared at the papers, his hands shaking as if they were written in fire. His roar was still echoing off the crown molding when he finally found his voice again. He held the pages up like they were contagious, reading aloud in a voice that cracked with fury. 18 months ago, while I was in a coma and Clara was barely conscious from chemotherapy, Julian Thorne, acting under valid Texas medical and durable financial power of attorney, transferred 98% of all Class A voting shares of Thorne Medical Systems into the Thorne Legacy Foundation Irrevocable Trust. He stopped, swallowed hard, and continued. With Sarah Jenkins, licensed Texas estate planning attorney, appointed as sole trustee. The trust is irrevocable under Texas Property Code Section 112. This instrument, dated and notarized at the Houston Medical Center, is effective tonight. Upon formal notification to all financial institutions, the freeze clause activates. No transfer, sale, pledge, or distribution involving prior shareholders may occur without trustee consent. Any attempt to revoke or amend is void. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Uncle Thomas's mouth fell open. Aunt Sarah's champagne flute slipped, shattering on the hardwood. No one moved to clean it. My father's hand shook so violently the paper rattled. This can't be legal," he rasped. Gregory Vance, my father's college roommate and a board member for 35 years, felt his phone buzz against his chest. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and went the color of ash. "Richard," he said quietly, holding the phone so the table could see the bank alert. "All operating accounts, lines of credit, and merchant services are frozen as of midnight. They're citing the trust notification that just hit their legal department." My mother made a sound like a wounded animal and slid sideways out of her chair. 2 cousins caught her before she hit the floor. Leo shot to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The documents were doing it for me. My father kept flipping pages, his voice rising with every paragraph. Contingent beneficiary upon trustee discretion, Thorne Health Systems LLC, a Texas entity formed 3 years ago for the purpose of. He looked up, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You built another company. With whose money?" He didn't wait for an answer. He already knew whose sleepless nights had paid for it. Gregory tried again, his voice softer now. "Rich, I just got off with the relationship manager. The freeze is ironclad. They won't even let us process tomorrow's payroll without trustee approval. We're locked out." Someone's wife started crying quietly into her napkin. The minister stared at his plate as if he had never seen salmon before. Leo lunged across the table, knocking over water glasses as he grabbed for the papers. My father yanked them away, clutching them to his chest as if letting go would make the reality vanish. "You think you can just steal my legacy?" My father screamed, his voice cracking. "After every sacrifice we made for you." I finally spoke, my voice flat and devoid of the heat that filled the room. You signed the power of attorney yourself. Mother signed hers the same afternoon. Both of you were perfectly lucid, and you knew exactly what the documents entailed. Texas law doesn't allow you to claw it back just because you've had a change of heart years later. My mother, still trembling on the floor, let out a thin whimper. We thought you were helping us, Julian. We didn't think you were robbing us. I looked at her for a long, silent second. I was helping you survive. You simply forgot to notice who was keeping you alive. Leo slammed both palms onto the table, rattling the silverware. We'll sue. We'll fight this until you have nothing left. But Sarah Jenkins's name was on every page, stamped with the official seal of the Texas Secretary of State. Irrevocable meant exactly that. Every person in that room with a law degree or a seat on a board knew it. Gregory Vance just shook his head slowly, the weight of the reality sinking in. My father slumped back into his chair, as if his spine had turned to glass. The papers slipped from his fingers, scattering across the linen. One sheet drifted into a pool of melted butter. The chandelier continued to shine, bright and merciless, on 22 people who had just realized the empire they were celebrating no longer belonged to any of them. Phones began to erupt before the caterers could even clear the dessert plates. Gregory's screen lit up first with another bank alert, then my father's, then every board member who still had the company's internal app. The same crimson banner appeared on every device, access revoked. Trust freeze in effect. Aunt Sarah grabbed her coat, muttering something about an early morning. Uncle Thomas followed close behind without finishing his port. Within minutes, the driveway was a chaotic line of reversing taillights. No one stayed to say goodbye. By the time the last guest had pulled away, the official email from Sterling Regional Health Network hit the executive distribution list. The subject line read, "Selection of vendor for enterprise-wide operating system." I had seen the notification an hour earlier. Sterling, 18 hospitals across Texas and Oklahoma, a $62 million contract everyone assumed Thorne Medical had in the bag, had chosen Thorne Health Systems. My company. The one I had registered in a cramped co-working space in downtown Austin 3 years ago, coding until 3 in the morning while the factory floor downstairs was still stamping out ventilators under the old name. The email was brief and brutally professional. After an exhaustive evaluation, Sterling Regional Health is proud to announce our partnership with Thorne Health Systems LLC for full AI-driven patient flow, supply chain, and revenue cycle management. Implementation begins Q1. My father read it aloud in the now empty dining room, his voice hollow. Leo snatched the phone from his hand, scrolled through the text, and then hurled the device against the stone fireplace. Glass and lithium batteries scattered across the hearth in a spray of sparks. At 8:17 the next morning, every employee at Thorne Medical Systems received a mass text from HR. Due to unforeseen banking restrictions, payroll processing for the current period has been suspended. Further updates to follow. By 9, the factory's internal messaging groups were in a state of panic. Forklift drivers posted photos of the main gates being chained shut by the bank's recovery team. The head of accounting began a live stream from the parking lot, weeping because her mortgage payment had just bounced. The family's longtime attorney finally returned my father's 19th call. I could hear every word through the heavy study door. "Richard, I'm sorry. It's a conflict of interest. Sarah Jenkins is on retainer with the trust now. I can't represent you against it. You'll need to find new counsel." The line went dead. Leo disappeared upstairs. 10 minutes later, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass rained down from the second floor. My mother ran up the stairs, screaming his name. Something heavy hit the hallway runner with a sickening thud. We later found out it was the mahogany dresser she had bought him for his graduation. My father sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, his head in his hands, staring at the scattered trust documents, as if they were written in a language he no longer understood. He kept muttering numbers under his breath, 96 million, 62 million, the mortgage balance, the medical bills that were still piling up. I stood in the kitchen, drinking coffee I couldn't taste, watching the empire finish bleeding out in real time. By noon, the local business journals had the story on their front pages. Someone at Sterling had leaked the vendor announcement, someone at the bank had leaked the freeze. The headline was merciless: Austin medical giant locked out overnight. New AI startup claims crown contract. My phone buzzed with a different kind of notification. It was a Series B term sheet from a Silicon Valley fund I had been courting quietly for 6 months. They had just increased their valuation by 40% after seeing the Sterling win. I accepted the congratulations with a simple thumbs up and darkened the screen. Upstairs, Leo had punched through the drywall and was now sobbing on the landing. Clara tried to hold him the way she had when he was 9 and broke his arm at soccer practice, but he shoved her away so hard she stumbled back into the banister. Richard didn't move to help her. He just kept staring at the same paragraph in the trust document, the one that stated in plain English that not a single share could ever be reclaimed. Texas law, ironclad and final. The house fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional crash from upstairs and my mother's whispered, "Broken please." I set my empty mug in the sink, picked up the small overnight bag I'd packed 2 days prior, and walked out the front door without a word. The cold November air tasted like freedom. 9 months later, the for sale sign in front of the Austin estate was sun-bleached and leaning. The old Thorn medical sign on the highway had been gone since the spring, replaced by a generic banner announcing an auction. Everything must go. The bankruptcy lasted exactly 11 weeks before creditors smelled blood the moment the bank statements hit the docket. The judge converted it to a Chapter 7 liquidation faster than anyone anticipated. By June, the factory floor had been gutted, the machinery sold in lots to a distributor out of Atlanta. The office furniture went to a local tech incubator for pennies on the dollar. The company that once supported 90 families in the suburbs simply ceased to exist. The house followed shortly after. The mortgage was in my parents' names alone. The trust had never touched the real estate. The bank filed for foreclosure in the district court, and won by default. The sheriff's sale took place on a humid Tuesday in August. A young couple from the city bought it for 60 cents on the dollar. They posted the closing photos on social media that same week: new quartz counters, fresh white paint, a bright future. There was no trace left of the family that had lived there for nearly 30 years. Leo lasted 73 days on the outside. He tested positive for fentanyl the first time he tried to visit Clara after the eviction notice. 2 weeks later, the police found him asleep in a stolen sedan with a backpack full of pills. His public defender negotiated a plea, 18 months in a state facility with mandatory chemical dependency treatment. My mother cried when they led him away in cuffs. Richard didn't even show up at the courthouse. They moved into a 1-bedroom unit above a laundromat, in a fading corner of San Antonio. Second floor, south-facing, $1,200 a month including heat. Between my father's Social Security and a diminished pension, they had barely enough to breathe. Clara's medical coverage handled the bulk of her maintenance chemo, but the copays still drained half of every check. They bought groceries with state assistance and kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save on utilities. Every lawsuit they filed died the same way. They tried 3 times, once in state court claiming undue influence, once in federal court alleging breach of fiduciary duty, and one final, desperate motion to unwind the trust. Every judge cited the same fact: the medical and financial powers of attorney were executed while both grantors still held legal capacity, witnessed by hospital staff and properly recorded. Texas does not recognize regret as grounds for revocation. The cases were dismissed with prejudice, leaving the legal fees to the plaintiffs. Richard aged 10 years in a single winter. His hair went completely white. He stopped playing golf, stopped answering the phone when old associates called to check in. Some mornings, he sat on the tiny balcony in his robe and stared at the parking lot until the sun went down. Clara tried to reach me once, using a new email address she'd created at a public library. "We're sorry. Please come see us. We have nothing left. I never replied. I closed the inbox that same week. The last time I drove past the old house, the new owners had put up Halloween decorations, glowing skeletons on the lawn, orange lights in the trees that used to be mine. The porch where Leo and I learned to ride bikes now held a welcome mat that said "Home Sweet Home" in cheerful, block letters. I kept driving. Today, I stand on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Austin, and watch the light bounce off the river the way it did when I was a child. The logo on the glass wall behind me carries the new name, Thorne Health Systems, NASDAQ ticker THS. We rang the bell 4 months ago. The opening price valued the company at nearly $2 billion. The stock has more than doubled since. My office is a sanctuary of white oak and floor-to-ceiling windows. A single orchid sits on the credenza. No photos on the walls. No family pictures. Nothing that reminds me of hospital recliners, the smell of antiseptic, or the cold weight of betrayal. I changed every number the week I walked out. New phone, new life. I blocked every cousin and every old friend who still had my mother's contact information. My assistant screens everything, not a single message has made it through. Sometimes, late at night, I pull up the old house on a real estate app out of habit. The photos cycle every few months, new furniture, new paint, new people smiling in rooms that used to belong to me. The algorithm thinks I'm interested in the market. It doesn't know I'm just checking to make sure the past is still gone. I never went back. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even when the social workers called about Leo's second overdose. I let the phone ring until the voicemail gave up. People ask if I feel guilty. Reporters, mostly, they want the story of the prodigal daughter who built an empire on revenge and now wrestles with her conscience. I don't. I don't feel triumph either. Revenge is a cold meal that leaves you empty. What I feel is quiet. The kind of quiet you only find when the screaming in your head finally stops. I kept the company alive when no one else would. I turned 5 years of sleepless nights into software that saves lives across 18 hospital systems. I created hundreds of good jobs in a city that watched the old factory gates rust shut. I funded free clinics that carry my grandmother's name, not because I wanted gratitude but because I could. This wasn't about taking something away. It was about refusing to let everything I sacrificed become someone else's unearned trophy. I still sign my name Julian Thorne because the law requires it, but the name feels like a borrowed coat. I haven't said it out loud to another human being in over a year. When people ask what the secret to my success is, I tell them it's the quiet. Some lessons are expensive, but they're still lessons. Never give more than you can afford to lose. Never mistake tolerance for forgiveness. Never assume the people who need you today will remember you tomorrow. And if the day ever comes when they try to hand your life's work to someone who wasn't there when it was bleeding, remember that the law can be a weapon, too, if you're willing to wield it while everyone else is busy clapping. I don't forgive. I don't look back. And I no longer carry their weight into my future. I changed every number the week I walked out. New phone, new email, new accounts. I blocked every cousin and every high school acquaintance who still had my mother's landline memorized. My assistant screens everything now, not a single message from that life has made it through. Some nights, I pull up the old house on a real estate app out of habit. The listing photos cycle every few months, new furniture, a different shade of paint, new families smiling in rooms that used to be mine. The algorithm thinks I'm a prospective buyer interested in the neighborhood. It doesn't know I'm just verifying that the past is still dead and buried. I never went back. Not for Christmas, not for my father's birthday. Not even when Leo overdosed for the second time, and a social worker called from the county medical center looking for next of kin. I let the phone ring until the voicemail gave up. People ask if I feel guilty. Reporters, mostly. They want tears or at least a dramatic, heavy-lidded pause for the cameras. They want the story of the prodigal heir who built an empire on the bones of revenge, and now wrestles with regret. I don't. I don't feel triumph, either. Revenge tastes like ash after the first bite. What I feel is quiet. It is the kind of quiet you only find when the noise finally stops screaming in your head. I kept that company alive when no one else would. I turned 5 years of sleepless nights into software that now predicts patient readmissions with 94% accuracy across 18 hospital systems. I created nearly 400 good jobs in a city that watched the old factory gates rust shut. I funded 2 free clinics in East Austin that carry my mother's maiden name, not because I wanted her gratitude, but because I could. That is the part strangers never understand. This wasn't about taking something away. It was about refusing to let everything I sacrificed become someone else's unearned trophy. I still sign documents as Julian Q. Thorne because the SEC requires it, but the name feels like a borrowed coat. I haven't said it out loud to another human being in over a year. When people ask what the Q stands for, I tell them it stands for quiet. Some lessons are expensive, but they are still lessons. Never give more than you can afford to lose. Never mistake tolerance for forgiveness. Never assume the people who need you today will remember you tomorrow. And if the day ever comes when they try to hand your life's work to someone who wasn't there when it was bleeding, remember that the law can be a weapon, too, if you're willing to wield it while everyone else is busy clapping. I don't forgive. I don't look back. And I no longer carry their name into my future.